Today we're going to do lesson 3, editing and creating symbols. And so as usual, we like to see what we're going to be creating, and this is a static flash page. Again, there's going to be no motion, no timeline involved, but it will let us play with these different robot symbols and some text 3D positioning. So let's go ahead and get started. Inside of Flash, let's create a new ActionScript 3 file, and let's look at the properties and set the properties as the book wants us to be 600 pixels by 450 pixels. And we'll leave the background color alone. Let's save this right away. So we have a let's put it in our start folder, and we'll call it 03 working copy.fla. All right, let's go ahead and start. First we're going to import some files that were already created for us, and we're going to import them into the stage this time, just to show a different way of doing this. Importing into the stage, if we go to the lesson 3 folder, lesson 3 folder, start folder, we want to look at the characters.ai. AI means it's an Adobe Illustrator file. Let's open that. And it shows everything selected, and with this, if you look down this shows all of the different paths and items used to create this robot and this hero character. Lots of different paths. Illustrator is a vector graphic oriented program, so it keeps everything as an object, every single thing. So we want to convert the layers to flash layers and place them in the original position, and that's all we need to do for that. Say OK. Now I have my symbols imported from Illustrator, and each one is separate. I can move them around separately. If I get the right tool, the selection tool here, move these around on the stage. But it's very useful to have these in the library itself. Notice when we imported them into the stage, they don't get put into the library. So there are different types of symbols. It's a reusable asset that can be used lots of places. I can have multiple copies of this one asset, this one actor on the stage, and it will only have to save the file once, so it becomes a very small file. These flash files become very simple and small if you utilize symbols correctly. But let's move on and convert this into a symbol, and then we are going to move it into the library for further use. So we're going to select our hero here, and we're going to select modify convert to symbol, sorry. Modify convert to symbol. Also, you can right click on the symbol and you can find these as well. So there's a convert to symbol there. We're going to call it hero. Leave everything else alone, registration point alone, say OK. And now it comes into our library. Now we have a hero as a symbol, and that's this little gear icon here shows that it's a symbol. And let's do the same with the robot. We'll call it robot. And now we have two symbols in our library that we can utilize. Now let's import some Photoshop files. Let's click on the top of our hero here, and we're going to, in the timeline, these are the various layers. Notice also that each symbol came in from the Illustrator file as a separate layer in our timeline, which is important to understand. So we're going to select the top layer, and we're going to import to stage the background file here. So this allows us to import Photoshop files as well, and both of them are selected. If we click on one of them, we want to import this as a bitmap image with editable layer styles. So each one could be imported differently. So we'll click on each layer in our file and select bitmap image with editable layer styles. And then we're going to convert them to flash layers and place them at the original position again. Go ahead and import. Now on the timeline, you know I have two different images, each separate, and to see them, I can turn them off. Sometimes it's good to turn the eyeball off, and you can see what exactly that looked like there. So there's the flare, is the ball of burning gas, and then the background behind it. All right. We're going to organize our library now that we have a bunch of things on the stage. Well, first of all, we want to move our hero and our robot above the flare, because notice how they're stacked on top of each other. So I can select both of them by shift-clicking each one and then clicking and dragging above the flare. Now they're going to be shown above that layer. Just like in Photoshop, everything is a layer that could be obscured by other pieces. So we're going to create a folder over here, because it's sometimes nice to create and separate these things out. All of our characters, as you get to have a very complicated Flash movie, you're going to have a bunch of these characters over here. So it's a good idea to keep them separate. So we're going to create a new folder. We can do that down here under the library, under new folder, or right click on the gray area and just say new folder. We're going to call this characters. And now we can drag a line around both of these to select both of the characters, and then drag those into our library folder that we just created. And we can expand and contract each of these folders to see what's in them. So it makes it a nice organization tool. So going to our robot, you can see that gives us a little preview of what we're working with here. If we double click the robot title, it goes into editing mode for editing the name of this symbol. So the way to double click this is either on the image above or on the little icon tool here, and it will take us to the same place. Now notice we're now in editing mode of the robot symbol itself, not the scene. So this is our robot symbol, and we can double click on it to look at the various pieces. Look at all of these little pieces that create this robot. There are 100 different elements, I believe, in there. And we can keep double clicking on pieces of them and eventually get down to just one. I double clicked about 3 or 4 times to get into this one area here. And once we have an area we can look at, I'm going to choose the fill button and pick a red, and it fills it automatically because I had that selected. If I didn't, if I went back out to the group, and let's go back to my selection tool, and I can select a piece like this, or with the tool, the fill bucket, I can come and only edit or fill one of these pieces. So that's lots of ways to do that. So let's leave his breastplate red there. Now to get out of editing mode, I can get my selection box again and go to the scene. And now I'm back out. The symbol has changed on the stage, and the symbol has changed in my library. notice if I make any change to my library symbol, it gets reflected on the stage. So these are just copies of whatever this symbol is in the library. That's an important point to understand. Every instance of this robot on the stage will get changed if I modify the symbol in the library. We can also edit the symbol in place if I just use my selection tool and double-click the robot right here on the stage. I'm now still in the robot editing mode here, but I can see a shaded background of what the stage looks like, so I can see it in place, and so I can see if the colors are going to match slightly, or if I'm editing something, if it's going to conflict. So I can do the same thing with the fill bucket. Pick a different fill color. Now notice I can choose a fill color down here just by clicking on this box, or I can go to the properties after I've selected the paint bucket tool. Sometimes the properties don't show up right for me, so I click unselect everything, go back to the fill bucket, and now I see the paint bucket tool. So sometimes it's difficult to get back to that properties of the tool itself if you have something selected on the stage. So once I have that, I can do this and select a different color, and that's the same as choosing the color down here. So I can choose some other green, come over here, and select my, well, I have to select my robot again, double click it. I'm in the robot mode. Ungroup it again so that I'm in the group mode so that I can see each individual layer. Then I can finally select the bucket with the color that I want and come in here and edit these pieces of the armor. So that's one way to do it. Take the selection tool. I can now double click on the gray area here, and that takes me, well, it was supposed to take me back to the I guess not on the gray area, but on the stage itself. So if I double click on here, it takes me out of the editing mode. So if I'm inside of editing mode, editing the robot, I double click on the stage, not on the gray area. Sorry about that. All right. So let's move on and start changing the position. They also talk about how I can break this apart. That's the same thing as double-clicking it. I can break it apart into its symbols and into its different pieces, and I can keep calling that break apart, and you can see that each piece now can be moved as well as just edited. So if you wanted to change just a piece of that character so that he's moving differently or something. All right, so I'm going to leave him back as a group by undoing those items. So I want to make sure I'm on the robot layer because I'm going to add more robots into this layer. So anything I drag onto the stage will go to the layer that I have selected. So I have the robot selected, and notice if I select something else on the stage, it changes what layer I have selected. So if I click on the hero, my hero is selected. I click on my robot is selected. So I want to have the robot selected so that when I add a new robot from my library, I can click and drag a new robot in place, and it stays in the robot layer. So to check that, I can turn that off, and you see that both of my robots turn off at the same time. So we're going to take this symbol and play around with it, take the free transform tool, and the book has you taking this control point here and flipping it. The problem is you don't know how wide it was originally very easily. It's a little difficult to see that. So, excuse me, what I like to do instead of the freeform for flipping something and keeping the proportions exactly the same, what I can do is under the Modify Transform, I can flip around the vertical axis. Well, and I always get those wrong. Transform, let's undo that and do the transform in the horizontal way. It's going to move in the horizontal position. So now his gun is on the left and it's retained its position better. I like that better. Now I can resize it. If I hold the Shift key down while I'm resizing, it keeps the proportions the same in the scaling. If I don't do that, I can get all kinds of distortions. As if I've distorted it like this and then hold the Shift key down, it goes instantly back into its original position. So I use the Shift key a lot because I like the original positions. So let's make him a little smaller, move him back here, and let's add another one, add another robot, pull him off from the end, flip him again, transform him in the horizontal way, size him a little bit bigger than the last guy, put him over the top of him, and now let's move my hero over here into the middle. So now I've got my big robot and a couple of small guys over here. All right, very good. Now let's talk about some rulers. If we go to the view, we can turn on the rulers, and the rulers show up on the top and the left. And as we move something around, if I click and drag this, you can see in the top ruler the left and right areas of where he resides on the ruler itself. So I can position him right where his left edge is right on the 400, for instance. So there's the rulers are very useful for that. Now we want to create a guide. This is a lot like Photoshop. If I want to create a guide that's closer down here, I click on the ruler itself and I can pull out a guide, and it's a bright blue guide here. And if I get close to it, it lets me, the cursor changes and lets me move this line up and down. So I could actually drag out a few of these as points that I'm going to use for aligning objects together. If I don't want one anymore, I drag it off in the horizontal position all the way back to the ruler. So that's one way to think of that. I can also drag vertical ones. So I can have a vertical, and I can have a bunch of these vertical bars that are used for guiding and putting things in place on the stage itself. So let's take those off, drag them back to the ruler, and they're gone. So this is the ruler, and they want to show you that you can change and position this to a physical pixel position, and they want you to double click this. But if you double click this with the ruler like this, remember what tool we had selected before. This is the free transform tool. So we need just the normal selection tool. Once we have that and we double click it, now we get the guide that they talk about in the book. I can change this to 450 or 35, and there's the guide now at the bottom of the screen. Now if we want to look and turn on or off snapping, we go to the View menu, Snapping, and by default the Snap to Guides is selected. So you don't want to select that. That will turn it off. So that's a toggle. I select it to turn it on. The check mark means it's on. And now when I move my robot, it will snap to that guide just perfectly. And same with the, see how it jumps down to the guide itself. So I can position my robot and my hero on the line across here. Okay, moving on to color effects. Let's leave our guide there. We're not going to use it right now. Switch over to our properties and the selection tool. Let's pick our smallest robot here. in the background. And now we have all kinds of effects. The color effect is what we're looking for here, and these panels can close or expand. I want to select the brightness panel and then move this to a -40 is what they have. If you can't get it with your ruler, just type -40 in the checkbox, and there we go. So notice how he faded into the background. His brightness is a little bit less. It makes it look a little more 3D, like he's behind there a little better. And let's do the transparency now. Let's select the golden orb here. You can guarantee that that's selected by looking at the flare. Let's go into the 3D effect and select alpha now. And we want to move that guy to a 50% alpha. 50% alpha. Now notice how the background shines through the orb. We can see the artwork from the background underneath this glowing orb there, and it also makes it recede a little bit farther into the background. All right, we can also add additional filters to this, a little bit like Photoshop. I can select my orb, and in the filters panel over here in the properties, I can come down and select this little page here. It says add filter, and I want to add a blur filter, and that gives me some properties about that particular filter that I want to play with. And we want to have a low blur, and the links they're talking about are this link here, so I can set the blur in the X direction differently than the Y direction. That's typically not used that often. I can change this to 10, and the Y will reflect that because they're linked. That's the point of that linking here. So I've applied a blurring effect, and you can see that that entire orb is now blurred. And I think we've done enough. Let's go ahead and save some of this. Excuse me. So let's now play around with rotation. That's always fun. So we need to add a text layer. Click on the hero, because remember, when we add a new layer, it goes above the layer we have selected. So we click there, double click it, call it text, come over here, select our text tool, properties tab, select TLF text so that we can rotate it, and we can select whatever type of font you want. I've selected dendritic voltage. You can set a size. I'm going to make it just a little bigger, maybe a 72 point. I'm going to make it a blue, and once I've got that all set, I can come over here and start typing, and we're going to call this Mech Wars. All right, I like that. That seems more like a spacey type of a font. So let's go and now select the 3D tool. Now this 3D tool lets me move things in a three-dimensional way, but I want to first move it up a little bit. So let's go back to the selection tool, move it up to the top so that I can play with it, go back to the 3D tool, and these rings are what you're grabbing on to change direction. So this blue ring will go, if we select the blue ring, the dark blue, it rotates around that point, that center point of the text. And this little guide here shows you where you were when you clicked it and how much you rotated it. All right. The red and green are still orbs, but they rotate in a different direction. It's just that we can only see the side of that circle, if you will. So I'm going to rotate it so it points backwards a little bit. And then the green also does the same way. It rotates around that green axis. All right, pretty cool. The orange tab, the orange circle, lets me rotate in a free form fashion, which can get a little bit difficult to figure out what you want with this. But I can rotate just by moving my mouse around in different directions, play around with that and get that in a free form way. So I'm gonna do something like that. And there's my Mech Wars. You can always reset the position if you go to the transform panel. If it's not selected, come up to Window and select the transform panel, and it will come up for you, usually over here on the left. But I've dragged this over to the top because I use that more. And in using the properties here, I can select and reset the X and the Y and the Z directions. Let's set my Z to be 0, and it will reflect here. So I can use hard numbers this way. And this is how you might do rotations using ActionScript. You can imagine I could rotate in the X direction, keep adding 1 to it, and it would rotate around that X axis, and you could do that programmatically to add some animation. All right. There's another way to transform, and it's hidden behind the 3D transform. If we go to the translation tool, which is slightly different, it gives us a couple arrows that we can play with. And there are actually 3 arrows. The green arrow lets me go up and down. It constricts it. Even if I go right and left, it constricts it to the y-axis here. So all based on a vanishing point, which we'll play with in a minute. But if you notice I go really high, it still looks like it's trying to point off to to a vanishing point that's over here somewhere. So I click on the arrow itself. The red arrow is in the X direction, so I can translate this around. This is the arrow for the Z direction because it's coming out of the screen. So if I pull down, I'm having it come out of the screen. If I push in, then it's going to go into the screen. So there we go. So let's move this around a little bit, move it back down to my Mech Wars, and now I've got a nice 3D with a vanishing point of somewhere over here, which we'll play with next. Go back to my selection tool, click on my 3D text here, go to the properties, and we can look at the vanishing point, which is at the 3D positioning. So this is the 3D. Let's close these others so we don't confuse ourselves. All these other filters, we can close all those. The 3D position and view, this lets us change the X, Y, and Z coordinates, the width and height of this. And this is the vanishing point. So the X and the Y, that is the point at which everything converges. So I can click and drag on this, and the gray line that's going across the screen here becomes where that vanishing point is. Okay, so we're going to move it over here somewhere. And then the Y vanishing point, we can do the same thing with, and you can see that it changes where that's going to point to. So I'm going to leave it right about there. This is the tool that they talk about at the end, the perspective angle. If you hover over this little photograph gives you a perspective angle. This is like in photography where I can make it look like the lens is really close to something, and so I can change that position of that as well. So I'm going to leave it like that. Position pretty good, and move him over here so he's a little more in the center of the screen. There we go. Got our Mech Wars and our symbols on the screen. We can save that and test it. So just to test the movie, always a good idea. And remember, every time we test it, it creates the SWF file for me, and this is close to what their final version is. And again, remember, what I want is the FLA file because that has all these settings and all your layers in it. So remember to save that and send me that file. Thank you, and look forward to seeing you next week.